I'd like to thank Ozan Shalab, I think Niara, Yoni, Anna-Maren, and colleagues for the very special opportunity to be here. Hélène has already elegantly noted the symbolism of the place and the extraordinary architecture and the kind of spiritual, as well as, I know, significant meanings in recent and maybe not so recent Basque history around peace processes, longer traditions of contemplation, deliberation, and spirituality. So to have, absolutely kind of repeating Hélène's sentiment really, there is an expression, an embodiment here of how much connections between democratic possibilities, citizen engagement, peace building, and other vital principles and practices come together. So I'm very pleased to be here. I've changed my mind a few times about what I'm going to say today, and some of the changes of mind happened because of the discussions we had yesterday. I was warned, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I was warned by our hosts that Basque people are rather polite, may not ask questions, and so yesterday I had open expectations of a roundtable discussion we had about democracy issues, and it turned out to be really lively. And everybody spoke, and we covered, I think we began with particular details about Basque democracy and what was missing and what was present and what was potential. And the conversation, as it got more lively, opened up the really difficult questions about, well, if democracy can be designed, and I'm going to be saying a little bit about that theme, who gets to do it? Where do they start? And if design of political systems is about context, one of my favorite questions or comments from the floor yesterday was somebody saying, okay, what is the Basque tradition of democracy? What is it? What historically and contemporarily is the Basque character of democracy? Is that something we can express in kind of general values or principles? Maybe. Is it also maybe something that can be expressed in terms of specific institutions? Maybe some of the ones that Helena's articulated recent and longer histories of. And I liked that conversation in particular because it's always dangerous to ask somebody to come and speak when they've written a book. Very dangerous. The first danger is they will carry it with them to the platform. The big danger is that they'll start to tell you about their book. So I'm going to gesture at the book more than try to tell you about it. Partly because the book says, and I feel, that democracy is sometimes much more difficult and complicated than the existence of a certain set of models sometimes suggests. And maybe I have to apologize for saying we need in some ways to think about breaking apart some of the received models we have. Participatory democracy, perhaps even elements of deliberative democracy, perhaps elements of liberal democracy, and look at the pieces that these models are constructed for, and to look whether we can rearrange those pieces in ways that suit a Basque or any other context, because democracy is not one size fits all. It's very different. It needs to be very different in many ways from one place to another. And in some ways, this is reflected in, I think, Nara, some of your comments earlier, where we talk about, okay, we want to deepen democracy, we want to strengthen democracy, we need to reinforce democracy. These are good ambitions. I sometimes wonder, though, if expressing democratic aspiration in that way suggests that we've got democracy there. We know what it is, we see how it's practiced, it's the legislature, it's an executive, it's a system of civil service, there are various other public bodies. It is under threat, and we need to strengthen it or defend it. So the it seems like a pretty solid, fixed thing. And one thing that I try to do in my work, and I would like to suggest to you today, is that we may need to make democracy, or think of making democracy, something it has never been, something it is currently not, in order to strengthen the practice of democracy. Maybe democracy needs to be remade in order to be strengthened. So, in some ways, I think a little bit less about what new forms of innovation in democracy, and I try to step back and think, how do we do that? It's complicated. How do we think about that in context? In a Basque context, where I'm from, in an Australian context, which is very different because it's a settler colonial society. And that raises very, very distinctive questions about for whom democracy applies. I may get a chance to say a little more about that in a few minutes. I'm going to look at Anna-Maria and ask if my slides are, I need to do something. I need to do that. And it's there. I'm not sure the quality of them is worth the huge screen, but it's viewable. So that is good. So my brief remarks will really be about Thank you, my colleague. I can see them there. Not so much about the content of what I call a democratic design framework, which is what my recent work constructs and what is there in the book, but more about the kind of tenor, the kind of ideal, the path that led me in that direction. So giving impressions, really, more than fixed arguments. So a strong conviction here is that we need to open up our ideas of democracy, being open to new ways of organizing and practicing democracy. Secondly, to bring a kind of design imagination to thinking about democracy. One of the most difficult things an academic can do is do interdisciplinary work. Now, our universities love saying our departments are interdisciplinary, our academics work across disciplines. I have to confess, I do quite a bit of interdisciplinary work with my theatre and performance studies colleagues and with design colleagues. It is not easy because they speak a different language. We almost need a translator headset sometimes, and we speak the same technical language. So I've spent the last few years listening to designers telling me, no, you've misunderstood this bit or that bit. But I'm going to move on to say what I find so attractive in thinking about democracy in an opened up way, of breaking it down into fragments more and thinking how they might be recombined. How incredibly helpful it is to try to think like a designer. I will continue to learn across disciplinary boundaries from my design colleagues who continue to point out the errors of my interpretation of their work. I've suggested already that democracy is not one size fits all, and I stress the importance of context. And in some ways, the tradition of academic work, the intellectual tradition that I've worked in for so long, too many decades really, similar, I think, to Hélène's, is democratic theory. I mean, you do more than that, and I branch out into some other areas, but that's kind of core area. And I think it's fair to say, certainly from my perspective, that a lot of the theorizing around models of democracy and so on, Hélène, I think, is an exception because Hélène quickly and elegantly linked so much to specific institutions, not least citizens' assemblies. But a lot of it over the years has been very acontextual. It's been separated from particular national, local, or even regional context. And it matters enormously, I think, that democracy is not one size fits all. Australian democracy must and will look different from Finnish democracy and Basque democracy. And you can get a sense of why I liked those questions so much yesterday about what does democracy mean in the Basque country? What should it mean here? And what constraints do context provide? And I've also tried to stress in the bottom right corner there that it is, there's a lot of work around democracy, not least democratic theory, but not only that, which stresses institution. What is a democratic institution? What practices make it up? What roles are played within them? And if you want to know how to deepen or strengthen democracy, it's the institution. There are others where it's more the principles or the values. You must start with equality, for example, or maybe a specific version of it, equal consideration of interests, which is one that's been influential. Designers that I speak to, design thinkers and practitioners, get a little bit nervous at this. They say, okay, this is a kind of systemic view of democracy. You want us to look with fresh eyes at democracy. You don't want us to use received or familiar categories necessarily. And a lot of design scholars who are involved in government, and there are people who do this much more than me in the room and know about it much more than I do in the room, do something that you often refer to as policy design. You're working in or with government about applying imaginative design techniques to shaping policy for energy, for health, for schooling, or whatever the policy area may be. And there's been a little bit of nervousness when I say, okay, maybe we can design polity, the political system itself. Maybe that is up for question when design comes onto the table, as well as policy. So that's been a useful and interesting conversation that I've had recently. So I like to think of democracy as not so much a model or a set of choosable models, but rather itself as a design challenge. Democracy is designed, has been designed, and in principle can be redesigned in lots of different contextual directions. We've already had a sense of, Nayara, you started us off with, let's do a list of crises of democracy, shall we? I've heard people talk about polycrisis. Have you come across this term recently? Democracy, or our politics more generally, is facing a polycrisis. It's around populism, it's around distrust of institutions, it's about disengagement of citizens, it's about the seeming incapacity of democratic political systems to focus on the longer term. So the idea that electoral cycles in particular mean short-term policy making, which leaves questions of addressing climate change locally and beyond, addressing rights and interests of future generations, some of whom are born and are amongst us now, others yet to be born? Is there something about democratic short-termism that prevents that? We have something that's already been mentioned. I think of it as algorithmic politics. You will know, Ellen and others, much more about this than me, but the way that we tend to be divided into tribes through social media and the algorithms of Meta and other companies, X, do the work of dividing us, feed our prejudices rather than attempt to inform or educate within or beyond our prejudices or pre-existing views. Can a design framework, a design attitude help with this? Well, I think in some ways it helps us to think of potentially radical institutional solutions, things that are unfamiliar, as well as those that might be more familiar. For example, there's quite a bit of work being done, including by a colleague of mine at Warwick, Simon Caney, about institutions for future generations. I believe in the Basque Country you have an ombudsman or ombudsperson system, a special form of that. The Finns have made some advances in this area to institutionalize an effective mechanism to consider the rights of generations as yet unborn in present-day policy making. I think about there are debates around the regulation of social media and even arguments that there should be a publicly funded public social media company which does better in many respects that we worry about around algorithmic politics than X manages to do. I see that debate just beginning to bubble up, and of course there are all different sorts of questions about that. But that too would be an unfamiliar type of mechanism. I think in terms of one other aspect of the crisis that people talk about, the idea that people don't feel represented. We often get this in surveys. And I know because of a conversation again yesterday that this was part of survey responses that were happening here in the Basque Country. People say, my views are not represented. The politicians feel too remote from me, speak a different kind of language. Do they even know what kind of life I lead, what kind of daily struggles that I and people I know and people in my family go through? So this is sometimes one element of what people talk about as a crisis of representation, this sense of remoteness, of distance, of difference, a kind of gulf between the represented and the representatives. But I do wonder sometimes, I think there is a value in thinking about democracy where there's so much talk of equality as a democratic principle, freedom, responsiveness, accountability. If I really wanted to bore you, I could tell you what page in the book there is a list of something like 50 plus principles that are often invoked like that. One that is often not there is decentralization and devolution. We don't think often enough, I'm saying generally, even though I talk about context a lot, but I think we don't think often enough about bringing effective governance, literally and figuratively, closer to the people. Even the most decentralized political systems in the world still have a nation-state centralist character to them. This may be one area because the Basque regional political organization is quite decentralist, and Helen mentioned Switzerland as one which is often held up as an example as well. It seems to me there is a lot more scope for bringing decision-making much closer to the people, literally and figuratively. And I'm not sure why, in my field of work, this idea of deconcentrating power or decentralizing it has played so much of a lesser role than, for example, the value or the principle of deliberation in recent years. Nero, would you like to throw something at me if I go over time? Because I'm not keeping time. Yeah, thank you. So I want to talk briefly about bringing in design thinking. I'm kind of skirting around my theory, as it were, but I'll come to that in a moment as well. And it seemed to me that in thinking about democracy, especially amongst democratic theorists, but also comparative scholars of democracy that I've worked with over the years, we needed something. We needed something to jolt the way that we think. And I think design thinking does help with this. Now, I know design thinking and design practice are not one thing. They are not one thing. But the notion of design, as many people in this room will know really well, has expanded beyond the design of artifacts like furniture and cars and computers in recent years. And many people who think of themselves in one way or another as design scholars or thinkers or practitioners will think now of the design of systems, the design of organization, the design of relationships and complementarities into and next to government, for example. And so design thinking has entered into the realm where it's not necessarily artifacts, though the material circumstances still matter. And it's important that designers talk about the architecture of parliaments, the buildings, arrangements of seating, the material elements that symbolize who is powerful and who is not powerful, amongst other things. But design thinkers talk about the active making or creating of a plan. So think of a plan for democracy. And I really like this aspect of we allowing ourselves, giving ourselves the permission to go back to basics about democracy. Let's really look at what shared ideas, or maybe not so shared ideas, of what we think that means. What principles or values matter to you or to me most when we invoke the term democracy? And I like the design thinking way of saying we can revisit that with a really open mind. Okay? Also the idea of accepting uncertainty. There is no single model of democracy we are looking for. We will never quite get it right, and I find that quite liberating. The idea of framing and reframing of problems and solutions. So this is absolutely central, of course, to design thinking. You think the problem is primary schooling in the Basque Country, for example, and access to it. I'm just making this up. So that's the problem. When you look at it and you think, okay, maybe that's not really the problem. Maybe that's contained within a larger problem about public funding and the shape of different political parties and programs in the parliament and how they did not enter into dialogue with each other. Or maybe it's a closer to the ground problem. Maybe the problem changes again. It's actually certain localities within the bigger cities in the Basque Country where access to primary education, for example, makes itself manifest, is a difficulty. So problems change. Problems can turn into solutions. Solutions can kind of turn into problems. I really like this aspect of design thinking that shakes up the fixedness of the idea of a problem and a solution. There is no final or decisive plan. We will never perfect democracy. That's obvious enough, in a way. It's important to remind ourselves that there is no final solution because political life, observing political life, the notion of democracy is invoked every day across a range of countries as if we have already achieved democracy. In Australia, in the US, in the Basque Country, in Switzerland, as if we have already achieved it. It is a solid existing entity and the result of a historical process that can always be improved. I also like from design this notion of abductive reasoning, because in my field, in thinking about democracy, there is normally a process of deductive reasoning, by which I mean, okay, what's the basic principle of democracy? It is equality amongst persons. That's up here. So what institutions do we deduce we need from that basic principle. And we get, as we go down that ladder, as it were, more specific about institutions, but always hanging off this peg of this basic value of equality. So that's great, or you could do the opposite, inductive. Start on the ground. Look at what practices and systems and institutions we have, and then sort of induce ideas of what we really think democracy is. I really like this abductive approach of saying, well, what could democracy be? It's the could. What could it be? What could it have been? Don't worry too much about evidence from the ground or neat philosophical deductions from a more abstract level. Allow yourself, liberate yourself to ask, what could it be? What could it become? And questions of redesign, and at the bottom there, the importance of context as well. I find the issue of context really challenging, and I spent several pages in the book trying to write about how, A, there is no neutral description of a political context. You and I could, especially you, because you are the experts, could sit here all day and think, what is the political and cultural character of the Basque country, and which elements of that political culture and other aspects of the culture are pertinent to what kind of democracy we are, what kind of democracy we might seek to become. There is no neutral definition of context. And yet, it's a missing ingredient of so much discussion of democracy, which tends to flatten the world out as if all countries, in particular nation states at that level, as if all countries are sufficiently similar that we don't necessarily need to be adapting or thinking of democracy differently for those different contexts. I mentioned my country, Australia, and I could include other kind of settler colonial societies that have struggled, I'm not sure if that's the right word, failed, perhaps, to find a way of treating with fairness and justice the indigenous peoples of those countries. And I would say my own country, Australia, ranks pretty much at the bottom of the group of settler colonial societies in the world in terms of delivering fairness and justice, whatever they mean exactly. And I would love to talk more about that and a referendum that took place in Australia late in 2023, but I won't. But my point here is, again, about how extraordinarily different it is to think in Australian terms, for example, about democracy when that question, justice for Indigenous Australians, is such a profound one. That says 10. That's more generous than I was expecting. So thanks. And if anyone is interested in that, I've been writing something about that. In late 2023, there was the first effort to recognise Indigenous Australians in the Australian Constitution. And that proposal came with the idea of a new body, a new democratic body called an Indigenous Voice. So this would be an elected Indigenous advisory body to the government and to Parliament at the national level. And this proposal was put to a national referendum in October 2023, and it lost. It lost 60-40 in a national referendum vote. And one of the reasons it lost was many people, many voters, believed the argument that it was not democratic. It's undemocratic. You're giving Indigenous people 2 votes, effectively. It was more complicated than that, but that was the kind of argument offered. So I think this kind of example, and I've written things disagreeing with that, I think it was I'm a voice supporter, it was a thoroughly democratic, imperfect, but a innovative, unusual, democratic move in the context of recent Australian history. So, just to reinforce some of these points, we talked a bit yesterday about a way that I frame my work in this book, Democratic Design in particular, is first order and second order. We don't need to get tangled up in that. But all I want to suggest here again is that democracy so often comes with prefixes. And I think of prefix democracy. Liberal democracy, participatory democracy, deliberative democracy. What are your favorite ones? Direct democracy, representative democracy. Some of them are so familiar, they just sound like democracy. Yes, representative democracy. Ancient democracy, there are so many. Sometimes, and I'm kind of repeating myself here or reinforcing, we allow those prefixes to do too much work. We allow them to take us to a place where we think, okay, there's that model, there is that model, there's another one. I have choices. There's a relative neatness of the terrain on which we're working. I'm exaggerating slightly. So I'm expressing again a skepticism about what I think of as prefix conceptions of democracy. So that's kind of first order in my view. Second order is really, like designers would say, back to the detail with an open mind, back to the parts of democracy, back to different sorts of institutions, maybe ones we've never practiced or never invented before, like an Indigenous voice proposal in Australia. Nothing like that had existed before, and doesn't quite exist either in places that do arguably a better job of dealing with their Indigenous peoples with justice and fairness. I'm thinking of some of the Scandinavian countries with Indigenous parliaments and with some other innovations in Canada, for example. But here was a new institution, a new proposal to deal with a distinctive contextual problem. And I think there was a need in that case, for example, to move past this received model, kind of prefix democracy, in order to open up the space to think about that. This also raises a question of, I talk about democratic design, we talk about redesigning democracy. We'll take the phrase democratic design. That can be, we can put emphasis on either of those words. Is it democratic design? We're trying to design or redesign aspects of the way we do democracy here in this context. Is that what it is, democratic design? What about the different emphasis? Is it democratic design? Who does the design? Can that itself be done democratic? If you take a citizens' assembly as a prominent example, as Hélène has talked about, is a citizens' assembly primarily to be democratic in itself, a democratic design, a democratic body, because it's randomly sampled from citizens and so on, to do design work? Or does it itself represent a designing body? So the emphasis on design or democracy can swing either way. Now, in the book itself, I work from design thinking, I work from traditions of thinking about democracy from different parts of the world and from political theory and political philosophy. And I come to a bunch of questions which I suggested to colleagues in our conversations yesterday. Use this, break it, improve it. I don't know if this set of 8 or 9 or 10 questions, depending on how I do it, but it's an effort to get us to think beyond received models. So this sort of thing. Think about context. I've talked about that. Think about which principles matter to you. Somebody else might think accountability is the core principle of democracy. For somebody else it will be, and you've emphasized this the last 2 days now, a citizen responsibility. Yes, that might be one of your cores. Compare where we are on that. We don't necessarily share even a sense of what we think the basic values of democracy are. Let's ask that question. So what are the principles to be realized? What system, when we're talking about a system, is it local, is it national, is it regional? Or are we thinking of a single institution? Are we thinking of a citizens' assembly along the Ostbelgian model or Paris model? And I know from conversations, and I've learned over the last day and a half, that there is serious consideration of a permanent citizens' assembly here in the Basque Country at the regional government level. So is it a single institution we're talking about, or is it systemic? So these sorts of questions, I think, bring to the surface assumptions that we don't necessarily share about democracy, why it matters, and what it could look like in different contexts. What institutions do we think would enact our basic principle? Maybe equality or accountability or citizen responsibility don't mean much until they are practiced, until they are enacted within certain institutions. How do we think institutions and principles can match? What sorts of incentives in our imaginary ideal democratic designs would be created? Other people in the room, again, will know much more about it than me, and Elena's already nodded to this, but how a citizens' assembly, for example, is designed, and in particular, what relationship it has to an existing legislature or executive, will create different sorts of incentives. So if politicians in a parliament, for example, know that they must, because it's legally been set up this way, that they must respond robustly to the recommendations of a randomly selected group of citizens in a citizens' assembly, that creates a relationship, that creates an incentive effect. That possibly means that this democratic innovation, this citizens' assembly, will not just be tokenistic or marginalized. When we think we've worked through some of these questions and thought, okay, democracy in the Basque Country needs to look different, it needs to look like that. We need to think of those practices, those institutions, the values. I've suggested decentralization as one example, which tend not to be emphasized or exploited so much in this general terrain of thinking about democracy. But what would an ordinary person on the streets of Bilbao think of your proposal? This is again about who gets to design, yes? There's a tradition in feminist theory of the importance of situated perspectives as being full of knowledge, very, very much situated in the person, that people will know more about their own circumstances than an expert looking from outside in may know. And I think that is very important. Not least, and again, we talked about this yesterday, I have colleagues in Germany and America, and there are a couple of people here who were talking yesterday, who take surveys on what the people think, what the real people, the ordinary people, no phrase is good here, think democracy is, how it's doing, and what should be changed about it, if anything. But of course, we experts who do these surveys, and we're always the interpreters, we are the mediators of these voices. These views do not come through in a raw and clear fashion. So there are interesting questions of interpretation and mediation of the people. We talk about elected representatives in democracy. Well, in some ways, there are a lot more representatives around than just elected ones. And some of them might be scholars and other researchers and other people involved in think tanks and foundations that are always mediating, representing, and interpreting what the people actually think. So I'll jump forward to the conclusion. I've emphasized those points already. And so I think the type of approach, and again, I've not gone into any detail on this because that would be unhelpful, I think, in the context of the time that I have. But I think there are ways of stepping back a little from some of our received ideas and models about democracy and to make life more complicated for us, to look at wider sets of existing and not yet existing practices and institutions, even as in the Australian case, modest, but in some ways genuinely innovative and radical possibilities. Tailoring to context, I've already stressed a great deal. Surprising perspectives, we, you, may surprise ourselves about what we can produce, what we can imagine, and what might be even made realistic from our imaginations about ways of structuring and practicing democracy. And we're often used to thinking of democracy as on a continuum of more or less. And there's a lot of discussion now, not least in the US, about how do you know when a system is slipping into authoritarianism from democracy? What's the measure? What's the sign? What's the giveaway point? I do not know the answer to that complicated and very interesting question. There was a recent piece in the New York Times that suggested that when opposition figures or opposition activists fear for their safety if they speak out, so this was a particular answer to that question, that is such a key moment. So that may be correct. There are other views of that. I don't know. So we're used to having this kind of continuum or spectrum, authoritarian, fading into democracy, and then we move towards, usually it's Switzerland, as a kind of set up as an ideal, even though my Swiss colleagues always say, hang on a minute, maybe not, I'm concerned, I think, in the general approach that I've taken and I'm talking about here today, not to think of more or less democracy, but to think differently. Different democracy, just different to context, differently structured, differently rethought, differently redesigned, which is more complex, but I think in some ways more interesting and more realistic than trying to come up with consistent measures of what is more democratic and what is less democratic. There was a very nice one saying thank you to my audience, so I'll just say thank you to all of you for listening. Yeah.